What is hyper grace, and where did that term come from?
So hyper grace has been a label that has been given to certain quote unquote grace preachers.
Okay.
Okay. So in other words, that's what they would refer to themselves as.
Hyper gracers?
They would say they are grace preachers.
Okay.
So individuals like Joseph Prince, Andrew Womack, Paul Ellis, they would label themselves as grace preachers. Okay. So there's been another group that has said, no, you're not just grace preachers, you're hyper grace. And what they obviously mean that in a kind of a derogatory term. Okay. So Joseph Prince, Andrew Womack, Paul Ellis, those who consider themselves grace preachers, all right, they would say that what is being accused of them of being hyper grace is really that their message is just a message of grace.
Okay.
Just grace alone. And that it's abundant grace, it's grace upon grace, it's grace without works, it's grace without law. And they would kind of sum it up really as Jesus is grace.
Okay.
So therefore we're just preaching Jesus.
So what is grace then?
Yeah.
What are we defining grace as?
And I think that becomes some of the sticking points.
Okay.
Because individuals, for example, Dr. Michael Brown wrote a whole book.
Mm-hmm.
Basically,
saw him in my research.
Okay, yeah, basically calling out these quote unquote hyper grace preachers.
Okay.
All right. And so Brown was saying that he believes their message is just like a kind of quote unquote sloppy message of grace. It leads people to feeling like they're free to sin however they wish because they're already forgiven and that nothing can affect their relationship with God. All right. So going back to your question.
Nothing they can do can affect their relationship with God, not outside forces.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, nothing
so I can't ruin it. That's what they're saying.
Correct.
These hyper grace teachers.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's what and they are saying that, and Brown is saying it's problematic that they're saying it. Okay.
Because I can ruin it?
Let's get into that in a little bit.
All right.
All right. But so your question first was there, or that you asked was, what is grace?
Yeah.
So in other words, we're going to talk about hyper grace, or these grace preachers are saying we're grace preachers. What do they mean by that?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's kind of where the disconnect comes a little bit. So traditionally, grace has been understood to be a gift that we are given by God that we did not earn. Okay. Like favor from God that's unearned. Okay. Love from God that's unearned. Okay. That's grace. But then also there's a second kind of component to this grace, that grace is not just receiving a gift that's unearned. Grace is also the empowering to live out that which God has called us to live out to. So grace, for example, grace empowers us to be able to say yes to Him and follow Him. Grace empowers us to be able to follow Jesus in the way that He would ask for us to follow Him.
Okay.
So that's kind of like traditional understanding of grace. Grace preachers would say that I was right in the first definition, that grace is given to those which, and it's not earned. You can't, it's unmerited.
Because we do bad things. That's why.
Right. Right. None of us deserve grace, in other words.
Okay. And
I think most Christians would agree to that. Like, we don't deserve it.
Okay.
We do receive it. Okay. But then they want to say that this is kind of where the disconnect becomes, where I, for example, and maybe individuals like Dr. Michael Brown would say grace is an attribute of God.
Okay.
Okay. It's an attribute of Jesus. They would say, no, grace is Jesus. Or Jesus is grace. Same way you kind of heard it before, like Jesus is love.
So if I were to keep going with that, since Jesus is in my heart, that means grace is constantly in my heart. So it's just working its magic in there every time I do sins and stuff.
Yeah.
So I don't have to ask for it because it's always there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, that's yes. And so there's this, and the disconnect there lies in the fact that if Jesus is grace, okay, so if Jesus is like the embodiment of grace, and I am saying it's an attribute of his, but it's not all of who he is.
Right.
So, for example, in
He
John,
also has long hair and yeah.
looks Jewish,
blue eyes.
right?
And...
No blue eyes, no. So when Jesus is on this earth, obviously he had
if the
those
police
kind
were
of
drawing
characteristics.
him, they would just write grace on the sketch paper.
I guess according to these grace preachers, maybe. Yeah. But
I was going to say he'd never get arrested, but he totally did.
Even Jesus got arrested.
Yeah.
So there you go. But I think that the kind of the core issue lies with the fact that, like, okay, John 1:16, for example,
okay,
says that John 1:14, Jesus came and had the fullness of grace and truth.
Okay.
In him. So he had grace and he had truth. And I think the danger is that when you emphasize one aspect of God, like this one attribute of grace, anytime one attribute is emphasized over and above all the other attributes of God, that's when we find ourselves in error.
Okay.
And I think that's what's happened. And I don't think that they're intentionally trying to lead people, for example, away from truth or lead people into sin. But I think that's the natural consequence of what happens anytime there's an overemphasis on something. So, for example, in legalism, it's an overemphasis on truth, on obeying all of the law.
Right. Okay.
And anytime we overemphasize any aspect of God or any aspect of the gospel, we end up in a form of error.